In this module, we try and analyze the various intermediate targets, for example, money stock, interest rates, commodity price targets, nominal GDP targets for short run and long run, and how the RBI attempts to achieve them under certain assumptions.
After studying this module, we shall be able to learn how to differentiate between the various policy instruments, operating targets, intermediate targets, and final targets. Understand different problems of monetary policy making. To begin with, first of all, we need to understand that different targets in an economic monetary authorities have two different types of targets. Final goals. It deals with relatively difficult issues of unemployment rate, inflation rate, output growth, etc. Also, these are measured on a lower frequency. Intermediate goals. These are relatively easier to control for RBI, such as nominal interest rate, money stock, etc. Also, these are measured on short intervals like few second interest rate or every week money stock. Intermediate targets are targets that the RBI attempts to achieve because doing so will help to attain the final targets of policy. But if final target is the goal of policy, why have intermediate targets? That is, why aim at intermediate target when the final target is the true goal? You might think the only reason for aiming at the intermediate target is to assure you of your best chance of hitting the final target, but we will see that this is not always the case. The answer to the question of why RBI adopts intermediate targets has several parts. One is that intermediate targets changes the monetary policy debate from a debate over difficult issues like the unemployment rate goal, the output growth goal, or the inflation rate goal to a debate over the goal for the intermediate target. It is easier to discuss whether the money supply growth rate should be 2 or 4% than whether the RBI should try to achieve an unemployment rate target of 6 or 10%. In this view, then the RBI adopts an intermediate target to make discussions of monetary policy less of a political and ideological contest. Another view is that intermediate targets provide timely information on the state of the economy, and the RBI's success or failure at achieving those targets is useful information for the RBI. According to this view, it is no surprise that the RBI's choices of intermediate targets have been variables such as interest rate observed every few seconds and the money supply. The final goal of policy are variables observed monthly in the case of unemployment rate, since the intermediate target is observed more frequently. It enables RBI to achieve its goal on time. The properties the RBI look for in selecting a variable to serve as an intermediate target are the following. Achieving the intermediate target must be consistent with the RBI's final goals for the policy. The intermediate target must be accurately measurable on a timely basis. The intermediate target must be controllable so that the RBI can actually hope to achieve it or at last move in the direction of achieving it. Consider a case when RBI adopt monetary aggregate as an intermediate target. Suppose intermediate target for the money stock is empty in the figure. Once the RBI adopts an intermediate target, it manipulates its policies. Beginning at point A, where MD intersect MS, an increase in money demand to MD1 moves the economy to a new equilibrium at point B, increasing both the money stock and the interest rate. However, with an intermediate money target of MT, the RBI reduces the money supply to MS1, shifting equilibrium to point C. This further raises the interest rate but restores the money stock to its target value. A reduction in money demand works in the opposite direction. First, moving the economy towards point D, and then after the RBI increases the money supply towards point E. Intermediate money targets thus can lead to variability in interest rate instruments to keep the money supply at the intermediate target level. The key result in the figure is that an intermediate money target can be achieved, but only if the RBI gives up control of the nominal interest rate.
The argument favoring an intermediate money target builds on the case against an intermediate interest rate target. First, immediate money target allows the interest rate to rise in response to shifts in investment demand or consumption demand not caused by interest rate movements, thus reducing fluctuations in aggregate demand from those causes. For example, suppose consumption demand decreases due to an unexpected widespread increase in thriftiness. This will reduce aggregate demand and lower both the price level and real GDP. If there is an intermediate money target, the reduction in real GDP will lower money demand, decreasing the interest rate, stimulating consumption and investment demand, and countering to some extent the initial decline in aggregate demand. Thus, the more volatile the components of aggregate demand are, the stronger is the case for an intermediate money target. In addition, an intermediate money target is less likely to take on aspects of a final target because voters are not very concerned about the size of aggregate money stock. Finally, there are no reasons to think the RBI will be unable to achieve an intermediate money target even in the long run. There are two arguments against an intermediate money target. The first concerns choosing among the alternative money aggregates. The RBI defines a monetary base M1, M2 and M3, and even these definitions change over time. We have seen that economists differ over which is the best. Thus, there is considerable debate over which should be chosen as the aggregate to the target. This is a particular concern because, as we have seen, the various measures often do not indicate that policy is moving in the same direction. The second argument against intermediate money targets is that they can lead to much interest rate variability. This is particularly true if money demand is itself variable, as shown in figure 6. Variability in interest rates leads to variability in both investment demand and consumption demand.
Now consider the same situation outlined for the case of an intermediate interest rate target. By choosing an intermediate interest rate target IT, the RBI has decided to manipulate the money supply to keep the interest rate at IT. Beginning at point A, where MD intersects with MS, an increase in the money demand to M1 moves the economy to point B. To counteract this increase in the interest rate, the RBI raises the money supply to MS1, moving the equilibrium to point C, where the interest rate stays at the target but the money stock has increased. A reduction in money demand works in the opposite direction, moving the economy first towards point D and eventually to point E after the RBI reduces the money supply. This shows that interest rate target result in fluctuation in money stock.
Let us now discuss the argument in favor of intermediate interest rate target. One important effect of interest rates is that on consumption and investment demand, two large components of aggregate demand. Increase in the interest rate affect these components and hence lead to shifts in aggregate demand, resulting in changes in the short run to both the price level and the level of real output. Intermediate interest rate targets hold the interest rate constant and tend to reduce variations in consumption and investment due to interest rate changes. In addition, keeping the interest rate stable reduces the impact of changes in money demand on real GDP and the price level. A change in money demand leads to a change in the interest rate, and this in turn shifts aggregate demand. Thus, variations or instabilities in money demand translate into movements in the price level and real GDP. An intermediate interest rate target can eliminate this problem, since the RBI counters the shift in money demand with the shift in the money supply to keep the interest rate at its intermediate target value. With a stable interest rate, the economy is insulated from any variations in money demand. In fact, the more volatile money demand is, the greater is the case for an intermediate interest rate target. The case against intermediate interest rate target is threefold. First, if consumption or investment demand increases for reasons other than interest rate changes, such as change in tax rates, the intermediate interest rate target will actually exacerbate the effect on aggregate demand. To see this, consider an increase in investment demand, which also shows up in the loanable funds market as an increased demand for loanable funds. This raises the interest rate, and the RBI responds by increasing the money supply, which reduces the interest rate. By doing so, investment demand increases even further than previously, as does aggregate demand. Some blame the inflation rate of interest rates in the last 1960s, when aggregate demand was high, as President Johnson tried to fight the Vietnam War and expand domestic transfer payments. The second argument is political one, that is, intermediate interest rate targets tend to take on life of their own, becoming a final target instead of an intermediate target. The third argument is that interest rate targets cannot be maintained indefinitely. Basically, the argument is based on Fisher equation and the idea that in the long run, the real interest rate is determined by real factors in the economy that the RBI cannot control. Interest rate target must imply a stable expected inflation rate at a rate implied by the interest rate target and the real interest rate. Economists are very much divided on the issue of whether this is a practical, especially in the long run. A commodity price target. Some proposals call for the RBI to adopt an index of commodity prices as its intermediate target. Others have a single commodity price in mind, usually the price of gold. All of these proposals have in common a desire for greater focus on price stability. The idea is that by targeting a price index of some kind, the RBI will better maintain a low and stable inflation rate. If the RBI adopted a commodity price target, it would use the instruments under its control to adjust the money supply to offset deviations of the commodity price from target. This is easiest to do with a single commodity. For instance, the RBI could target the price of gold by offering to buy or sell gold at an announced price. If the target price is below the market equilibrium price, there is an excess demand for gold at the target price and the RBI ends up selling gold to the public. In the process, the RBI accumulates rupees which are removed from circulation, reducing the monetary base and hence the money supply, and this leads to a decline in the overall price level. The decline in the overall price level shifts the demand for gold to the left. That is, at every price of gold, demanders want to buy a smaller amount of gold when the overall price level declines. The fall in the price level also shifts the supply of gold to the right, as suppliers are willing to supply more gold at every rupee price of gold. The net effect is to eventually reduce the amount of gold the public buys from the RBI to zero.
Let us take an example of commodity price targeting. Suppose the RBI could target the price of gold by offering to buy or sell gold at an announced price. The initial equilibrium is at point A, where the price of gold is P0 gold. The target price of gold is PT gold, which is below the initial equilibrium, meaning there is an excess demand, D0 minus S0 for the gold that the RBI must fulfill by selling gold to the public. As public trade rupees for gold, the money supply is reduced. Eventually, the overall price level declines, shifting the gold supply to S1 and gold demand to D1, with an equilibrium price of gold equal to the target price at point B.
A disadvantage of targeting the price of gold is that any change in the demand for or supply of gold will lead to a change in the equilibrium price, which in turn will lead to changes in the supply and the overall price level to restore equilibrium to the target price. For example, a large gold discovery would lead to a large increase in the supply of gold, shifting supply to the right. This would reduce the equilibrium price of gold below the target price. An excess supply would occur at the target price and the RBI would buy gold, causing an increase in the monetary base and hence in the overall price level. Thus, a gold discovery would be inflationary. What about more complex price targets? Various types of commodity price indexes have been proposed. The advantage of larger group of commodities is that the money supply will not have to be adjusted as much to changes in the demand for or supply of any one commodity. If the index consists of gold, silver and other metals, a large gold discovery will have less of an impact than it would if just the prices of gold were being targeted. The disadvantage of such targeting is that it would involve the RBI in buying and selling a bundle of commodities. This process is more complex than buying or selling a single commodity such as gold. Another disadvantage of targeting commodity prices is that the link between changes in commodity prices and changes in the final targets of policy, such as the overall price level or the level of real GDP, is poorly understood. Indeed, this is the primary problem with targeting commodity prices. If we don't know how commodity price changes get reflected in the unemployment rate or the overall price level, it is difficult to know how we should set the intermediate target.
Now we will discuss two suggested intermediate targets that RBI has not tried. These are a commodity price target. Some proposals call for the RBI to adopt an index of commodity prices as its intermediate target. The idea is that by targeting a price index of some kind, the RBI will better maintain a low and stable inflation rate. If the RBI adopted a commodity price target, it would use the instruments under its control to adjust the money supply to offset deviations of the commodity price from target. A nominal GDP target. Another proposal is to target nominal GDP, a strategy sometimes called nominal income targeting. In some ways, this proposal is related to that of targeting an overall price index. The basic idea is for the RBI to adjust the money supply to keep nominal GDP at the targeted level. If the velocity is constant, the RBI can do this as long as it can control the money supply.
Another proposal is to target nominal GDP, a strategy sometimes called nominal income targeting. In some ways, this proposal is related to that of targeting an overall price index. However, the nominal GDP target might be best thought of by recalling the equation of exchange, that is MV is equal to PY. The right hand side of that equation is nominal income or nominal GDP, and the left hand side is a product of the money supply and velocity. The basic idea is for the RBI to adjust the money supply to keep nominal GDP at the targeted level. If velocity is constant, the RBI can do this as long as it can control the money supply. There are several benefits to nominal GDP targeting. One is that by targeting nominal GDP, the RBI is able to promote some stability in the price level. Recall that the growth rate of nominal GDP is simply the growth rate of real GDP plus the inflation rate. If the RBI targets a nominal GDP growth rate of 5% and real GDP is forecast to grow at 3%, the RBI is implicitly targeting an inflation rate of 2%. A second benefit is that nominal GDP targeting provides a certain amount of built-in stabilization against changes in aggregate supply. Monetary policy is directed at controlling aggregate demand, and most policy advice is directed at least implicitly at keeping aggregate demand at some desired level. However, this will achieve a price level and or real GDP target only if aggregate supply is stable. If aggregate supply shifts, both the price level and real GDP will change.
Let us illustrate nominal GDP target with the help of a diagram. Suppose the economy is in equilibrium at point A, where SRAS and AD intersect. The initial price level is P0 and the real GDP is Y0. This equilibrium satisfies the nominal GDP target. Since it lies on the curve P multiply Y is equals to T, which is the curve drawn so that the product of the price level and the real GDP P multiply Y equals a target value T. An increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD1 moves the economy to point B in the short run. The resulting increase in the price level and the real GDP violate the nominal GDP target. A reduction in the money supply will shift aggregate demand back towards AD and restore the target value of nominal GDP.
Thus, if aggregate supply shifts right, the equilibrium price level will fall and the equilibrium level of real GDP will rise. In figure, this effect is shown as the movement from equilibrium at point A to point B. However, at point B, the nominal GDP target is violated. The RBI responds by increasing the money supply and aggregate demand to achieve equilibrium at point C, where nominal GDP is restored to the target level T. In this case, the RBI moves to generate a greater increase in real GDP and a smaller decline in the price level than would have occurred had aggregate demand remained constant. Notice too that the nominal GDP target moves the short run equilibrium closer to its eventual long run equilibrium, which will be at an even greater level of real GDP. Thus, the nominal GDP target encourages quicker short run adjustment towards the long run level of real output. Nominal GDP targeting has much to recommend it. It stabilizes aggregate demand and hence the price level. If aggregate supply is stable, and it helps the economy adjust more quickly to changes in aggregate supply.
Let us now illustrate the case of nominal GDP targeting with rising aggregate supply curve. In figure, starting at point A, a rightward shift in aggregate supply causes the price level to decline and real GDP to rise. The new short-run equilibrium at point B violates the nominal GDP target and calls for RBI to increase the money supply and hence raise aggregate demand to AD1. The result is point C, which satisfies the nominal GDP target and results in higher real GDP and a smaller decrease in the price level than at point B. Note that the equilibrium at point C is closer to the new long run level of real output Y1 than is the equilibrium at point B. Nominal GDP targeting speeds the economy movement towards the long run equilibrium level of output.
However, nominal GDP targeting has several disadvantages. First, nominal GDP is announced only every quarter. Other variables are known at much more frequent intervals. Second, it is difficult for the RBI to control nominal GDP. That is, changes in the money supply do not immediately show up as changes in the nominal GDP. In fact, only in the long run are changes in the money supply reliably linked to equal percentage changes in nominal GDP. In the short run, the link is much more tenuous. Thus, there are problems with nominal GDP targeting that echo those with price level targeting. and these difficulties may continue to preclude the RBI's use of nominal GDP as an intermediate target.
In this module, we have looked at various important intermediate targets generally used by the RBI, that is money stock and interest rates. We have found that the target of an intermediate money target can be achieved only if the RBI gives up control of the nominal interest rate. On the other hand, the intermediate interest rates can also be achieved at the cost of losing short-run control of the money stock. We have also discussed various views for and against both the intermediate targets. In addition to this, we have also discussed some other proposed intermediate targets like commodity price targets and nominal GDP targets.